lecture this semester. I'm very excited to introduce to you Malcolm Fraser, former Malcolm Fraser architect, who's going to talk to us today about community, utility and wellbeing. Some of his projects include the Scottish Poetry Library, the Storytelling Centre, Arcadia Nursery, to name a few. And yeah, so we're going to talk a bit about housing and things today. So,
housing and homes. Yeah.
Housing and homes. So yeah, I'll let you.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura. Laura asked me to talk about housing. We're continually told we're in the middle of a housing crisis. I like to try and think about what that is and discuss that with you, the reasons for it and how it affects us as architects. I also want to think in a larger way about how Scotland is changing, and not necessarily for the best. There's what I passed on the train on the way up, endless Diddy boxes rolled out by developers who, if you go and see their sites, tell you that you're daring to be different if you buy one of these shoe boxes. And it seems as a nation we're kind of atomising, we're turning into wee bits. We used to be an urban nation. If you go around Dundee, you see fantastic tenements and a social way of living. That means we know our neighbours, we get the benefit of community. We are understanding more and more that well-being and long life is as much about how many friends you have as to your physical health. A community sustains and maintains you. And we used to be able to do it, and yet you go and you look at something like that, you see the headline in the Courier. There's been this daft thing that some local councillors have heard that this tenement block was going to cost thousands to repair. So they're knocking it down and they're going to spend millions building a new one that will not be built off stone with hundreds of years of life in it, will not contain the community utility and well-being that we had before. But we are part of an industry which likes churn. When you go out and work, you perhaps will understand that it is thought to be in our benefit if we knock down old buildings, build new ones which are actually pieces of shit and they fall down again, so therefore we build more and more. And the world talks about it in terms of development churn, or the word deal flow is used a lot, and it just means lots of money churning and coming around. But these things are not necessarily good for the environment. You stick that stone building with hundreds of years left into a landfill site, build another building that's going to fall apart in 20, stick it in a landfill site again. It's environmental madness, it's social madness. So these are just some of the things that I was thinking about in terms of Dundee as I came here. So I'm an architect, I think about architecture, I care about making buildings, but these are all my buildings. But when you've been making buildings for a while, you start to understand that there's a political context that you do it within. There's a social and financial and political context. And I like to understand, if we do, as we say, have a housing crisis, what's the policy, politics and placemaking that's brought us to the state that we're in. So I'm going to be very unarchitectural and talk about the political issues around house building. And I produced a paper, Housekeeping Scotland, and I do a lot of work. I'm on the board of this thing called the Common Wheel, which is a lefty think tank, which gets listened to in Scotland. It's good. We've got some really serious economists on our board, and I've also led the government's town centre review, community and enterprise in Scotland's town centres, which looked about place and community and how to change financial levers. So I'm aware of government policy, can talk to ministers, etc., about those sorts of things. So there's a lot of stuff going on, but it's mostly talking shops, and it's all about people trying to be important. So I think they're important and try to sound off. So I've really been trying to think of the things, the real reasons behind those issues that we're talking about. And if I ruled the world, what would be my simple 10-part programme for housing reform, what the things we have to change. And there's a bit of architecture in there along the way, hopefully a good chunk of architecture. And I hope it will interest at least some of you to start to think about the wider issues around policy and politics and regeneration. So in terms of why we've got a housing crisis, my first and biggest thing is that we're fixated on the wrong model. We used to produce council houses, we used to produce houses on the continent, we produce houses under different housing models, collective self-build. But we in Britain, in a kind of old-fashioned Thatcherite neoliberal way, have obsessed our way down to there only being one model, that a private developer borrows from the bank, you borrow a mortgage, you buy whatever they give you, whether it's slightly modified to look a bit Prince Charles or made to look a bit modern or whatever, it's essentially their product. And that's a problem, because actually the volume house builders don't want to build a whole load of houses, because if they keep the supply really, really narrow, then the price is high, so they can strangle supply, their profits are really massive. If instead of building 1 million, they only build 100,000, they can only sell them to the very richest. So it's not in their interest. And the idea that we were all going to get a mortgage and buy one of these is the idea that nearly crashed the world economy 10 years ago. So we have to move beyond the idea that the private sector is really the only model to deliver houses. But we don't, because when the government says, well, we need more houses, what do? But they do a scheme, a Help to Buy scheme down south, which has to be reflected in Scotland politically. But Help to Buy is free government money given to house builders, and it results in two things. One, higher prices, because the market's very efficient at turning that money into profit, so it doesn't actually help you buy. It goes into higher prices, and then it goes into the house builder's pocket. And that's Jeff Fairbairn, does anyone know, he's head of Persimmon Homes. Does anyone know what his bonus was last year? 100 million. And that is out of our tax money that went to the government, and the government gives out in House to Buy. It's translated directly into the profits of the house builders and the bonuses for the very richest of them. So if we have to move beyond that, we'll get to what we move beyond that to. The second thing that we need to do is we need to build more social housing, more council housing. And what I and the Commonweal have been lobbying for, and the government in Scotland has listened to, is that they have announced the creation of a national investment bank. So that bank will invest in new technology, it will invest in renewable energy, but it will also primarily invest in council housing. We aren't all going to get a house, so we need to provide for those who can't afford a mortgage. So that's fantastic news, and a really wonderful thing for Scotland that that's happened. Its terms of reference are being negotiated at the moment. Commonweal, we're meeting them today to talk about those things, and we're reminding them of the need to restart social housing programmes and put massive money into housing. It's been capitalised at 10 billion, so it's a really substantial amount of money. And then we are also talking to local authorities and to government about, instead of PPP being public-private partnerships, these things that put up schools whose walls fall down and that are so rubbish, that local authorities link up with the National Investment Bank under public-public partnerships, and we're talking to them about a national infrastructure company to direct funding and money sources and help with procurement with local authorities, etc., so architects get paid a wee bit more aside from anything else. The next thing we're working on is stalled sites, because a place like my Edinburgh, even though Edinburgh has boomed, even though house builders say they need more greenbelt to build in, the foreshore of Edinburgh has got some poor communities along it and is absolutely empty. It's got huge vacant sites. And the reason for that is that land speculators sell them back and forward to each other until they get to a level they can't be built on, and then they ask the government for subsidy to build them on, whereas all the money has gone into the speculation over the land. So I'm working with Land Reform, which is a good national initiative, to bring in compulsory sales orders So sites like that, if they're lying empty, a local authority can put it on the market, and the price can be reduced to a level at which it can be built on. So it's kind of exciting, technical, upstream stuff that would make a lot of difference to housing supply in a place like Edinburgh, and with national investment make a lot of difference to the supply of council and public funding. The other thing, the other potentially enormous source of supply of wealth is in infrastructure funding, because at the moment what happens is that people fight over bits of greenbelt. See, if Edinburgh expands, which it will build out into the countryside. So at the moment, land speculators going around the farms there and going into agreements with the farmer to give them lots of money if they can get planning permission for turning the greenbelt into farmland, into housing land. Because as farming land it's worth 15 grand an acre, as housing land it's worth £1 million an acre. So immediately the council says we are going to build on these bits of land, the price will leap, and that money will go to the farmer, the land speculator who's tried to go into agreement with them, and will immediately be fighting for money for infrastructure again. That means not just roads and sewers, but hospitals, health services, schools, all those sorts of things. The reason we can't build a lot of the time is that there isn't the infrastructure to support it. It's one of the reasons why building in the north of Edinburgh would be good, because the schools there are closing down because you don't have enough pupils. If you put the housing there, that would be the right place for it, keep the schools open, we wouldn't have to pay for housing too. Instead, house builders, of course, want the green belt. So if we can change the nature of what happens when that land is designated for housing, we can change where that money goes. So with land reform again, I'm proposing to the government that we change the Land Compensation Act, that local authorities can buy up that land at existing use value, which is how they built the new towns in Scotland, or the new town in Edinburgh. That's how many Asian economies work. So we've worked out that the next 10 years, 8 billion is going to be released in land value in Edinburgh. That 8 billion could go into public infrastructure to build good schools and hospitals, take the tram out there instead of going to land speculation. So that, again, that's a sort of upstream thing which is mind-bogglingly interesting, changes the whole landscape for housing, puts money into local authorities' pockets, allows them to build council housing, etc. So that's land value capture, looking at the Land Compensation Act, how they built the new town, how they built the new towns over Scotland at that time. And it could also mean that when you have public investment, like in the V&A, or if you put a railway line in down to the borders, local authorities could buy up the land around it, because the land value rises there, and again that usually goes to the farmer or the landowner. So instead of speculation bringing public money off-site, the public money would go into public infrastructure. Or if you put a new office, a new public tax office in the blasted parts of North and East Glasgow, or a new Scottish film studio in there, again you could pay for it by the value of the land that was raised round about. So it's a new way to capture public investment. In terms of diversification of supply, going beyond volume house builders, Diddy box format, a huge problem in the cost of a house is that so much of the value of the house goes into interest. It's the money that that's charged you for borrowing for mortgage, the money that the house builder borrows from the bank to finance the purchase of the site. We need to go back to the old post-war model of social housing. But there are other models out there, and other ways to lose that bit. And self-build is an interesting way of doing it. Now, self-build, you would normally think, is building houses for yourself. And this is a house that my wife and I built for us up the west coast of Scotland. It's sort of your Grand Designs world. We have the world's most fantastic view out over Egg and Rum in the distance. It's green oak and Douglas fir, hangs out over the edge of the rocks. There's a terrace deck outside. The building smells nice, natural insulation, there's no polythene in the building. So that's self-build. But this is self-build too. This is local authority funding that allowed people to bypass house builders and their profits and build for themselves up in the Highlands. So obviously it looks very conventional, doesn't have to. This is self-build in Findhorn and Dunland Eco-Village, more ambitious. But self-build is the prevalent way of building on the continent. Half of homes in I think Belgium and Germany are built by this. The self-build is great because it means if you get together with your neighbours, pool your mortgages, you can build cheaper because you miss out on the developer's profit. And with that money you could either build cheaper, or you can build nurseries, office space, communal space, cafes within the development. So this is an example in Holland. And as well, if people are building for themselves, they are more likely to employ an architect and be interested in sustainability and using good materials and those sorts of things. So you get better architecture out of it. In Britain, we've not used it because Britain is so wedded to debt. That's why the volume house builders are so loved. That's why mortgages are so loved. Britain thinks that borrowing is a good thing, and actually spending and spending wisely on your own behalf is often a better thing. But there's one fantastic example in Scotland, and this is guy John Kinsley, who's a friend, who's an architect, who got together a few friends, put up an advert in Portobello in the north of Edinburgh, bought a scrag end of site on the end of a tenement. That was a proposal, and it's now finished, and it's just fantastic. It's built with cross-laminated timber, natural breathing technology, cost less, proper architecture. So I'm desperately trying to persuade the government to put structures in place that allow for people, communities to get together, to do this themselves, and it's a fantastic way forward for architects. Instead of working for a developer or a developer's banker with all the grinding down and dumbing down, you get to be ambitious and realise people's ambitions, because people like modern architecture and they like views and openness and simplicity if they get to choose instead of just being presented with the normal models. The next thing that I care about and think about a lot is that, again, we obsess about new build, and whereas we really should first, before we build a new, make the best use of our existing resources. And the number of empty homes in Scotland is quite staggering. Some people say it's 34,000, others say it's 80,000, others have said it's 100,000. And given there's a housing crisis, it's absolutely disgusting that should be the case. That number doesn't even include things that particularly I care about when I was leading the government's town centre review. Empty flats above shops tend to not even be named as empty property. They are usually called commercial property. And bringing them back into use, bringing up an empty flat above a shop, Central Perth's got 100 empty flats. If you developed 100 new build on the edge of Perth, they'd be 100 grand each. But if you developed 100 new build in these empty flats in the middle of Perth, they'd be 10, 20, 30, 40 grand each. It'd be more difficult. There'd be more work for architects, there'd be more work for surveyors, small builders, which is why government doesn't like them, because government likes house builders and big, dumb, stupid things and giving them a greenfield site outside town. But we would be far better if we care about our towns, which government says it does, if we care about the health of the shops and bars in them, which government says it does, if we care about community, about not needing a car because you can walk to the shops, because you can walk to your work, we should be developing these existing buildings. And I do a lot of work with the Scottish Empty Homes Partnership, which is run by Shelter Scotland, and part of my thing I was proudest about in the Town Centre Review was getting them more funding and getting councils funding to put into empty homes officers, to bring these onto the market, to work with the owners, to show the owners that they have money to be made if they turn these into homes, to work with housing associations to take them over or even student housing flats, student housing providers to take over 100 empty flats in Perth city centre. Sticking with making best use of existing resources, we need to tax people properly, and that's where I was brought up. My mum's still there, and because she's there on her own, she gets money out. She gets a 25% rebate on her council tax, when actually she should be charged more to try and lever her out. So, I've not said this to her, but we do want to encourage old folks out of big family homes so they can be released back into the market. And at the same time, as well as the step of putting her tax band up at the top, because the top tax bands are far too low, we should be providing more retirement villages, care homes, all those sorts of things. If local authorities can get more funding through the initiatives I've already mentioned, they should be building places where co-housing for old people, they can keep each other cheerful, look after each other, and move out the old family home. And then the last place where it's absolutely crackers with how we deal with the built environment is in VAT, because if you repair, so this is on Barra, if you repair that house, you get charged 20% VAT. So they'll have done their sums and worked out it's cheaper to build a new Diddy box behind, and that will fall down. And as architects, I hope you look at the integrity and beauty and simplicity of that, which that doesn't have, and feel a sense of loss, not just cultural, but in sustainability terms, letting that building, with its hundreds of years and its wonderful materials, fall down because of a tax lever which encourages you to unsustainably build a new house behind, is just ridiculous. I've been campaigning on that for 15 years, I think. I happen to live around the corner from Alistair Darling, ex-Chancellor, so I managed to persuade him that it would be a good idea to put flat VAT rate of 5% across construction. Gordon Brown scalped him and told him he didn't want that. I think, again, it's because government likes big builders, cleared sites, the financial advantage of knocking things down, building it again, knocking them down and building them again. That's where their interest lies. So we're still in this bizarre and iniquitous situation where these buildings moulder because of 20% VAT, and these buildings get built on the back of it. And it's not just wee houses in the countryside. I did a lot of campaigning here. This is the Commonwealth Games Village in Glasgow at Dalmarnock. The housing there, if you've been there, it's nice, it's good, it's relatively dense. It was based on sustainability. But to build it, they knocked down 6 streets of red sandstone tenements. It cost them an enormous amount of money to do that, because they had to buy out residents. And the last one wouldn't leave. They had to get, there was police helicopters, about 100 police removed them from it, and then they demolished these 6 streets of tenements. Again, it's because of the VAT, because of the amount of VAT that it would have taken to repair them. And the architects at the time complained that the people were kind of poor and old looking, and they weren't the sort of aspirational young people, I suppose, like you, that they would have liked in these places. Now, if these buildings had been in the west end of Glasgow, the studio would have been full of students who would love them. It's just a kind of demonising of the poor, that's too good for them. They can't have that. That costs money to do up, so we knock it down and we build a new for them. And that's, again, not just a VAT issue, but we have a kind of shared cultural contempt sometimes for buildings of the past and their solidity, and an overexcitement in the new at times. My next category of thing we need to change is around the issue of placemaking. Now, I assume placemaking gets talked about. You know what people mean by that. It's good. It's good that we actually know that that's an issue, that the kind of key components of community and place are things we need to care about. My concern about them is that they are applied in Scotland as elsewhere in a particularly scenic way, Particularly in Scotland we have a particularly royalist way of looking at placemaking. So in a Prince Charles way, if you just stick some nice pediments on a building and make the roads a bit wiggly, that's what placemaking is. And it's not. It's a purely scenic way of placemaking. We need to understand it a bit deeper. And I get particularly across, this is the Scottish Government's general guide about layout. So that's what you can't have, a cul-de-sac, and that's what you have to have. And I think what's so great about having cars going past everywhere, I've lived in 2 cul-de-sacs, it's been great. You know everyone there, everyone who comes in, everyone who leaves, you know, is your neighbour. And I think we need to think harder about what makes community than just think about wiggly streets and pediments. And actually it's quite interesting what the house builders call pediments, in that I've done work for 3 of the volume house builders, and the first time I ever presented to them, I presented something that looked very simple to the marketing department. They said to me, "Where's the gobbons?" I said, "What?" He said, "You know, the gobbons." I said, "No, what do you mean?" They said, "Well, the pediments, the half timbering, the trellises." And I realised that they called what they basically would describe what they do is put up a dumb box and gob on it. And that is a technical term throughout the house building industry, and that shows you with what contempt they regard their work. And I once used this in a newspaper article, and I got a phone call from the chief executive of their lobby body, Homes for Scotland. He said, I see you've been using this word, Malcolm. I'm going to take you out for a bacon roll," which I thought was a bit of a threat almost. So he took me out for a bacon roll and he said, "No, Malcolm, you don't understand. We have moved way, way beyond gobbons." And I just had a wee tingling hope that he might have understood what a terrible term that was. I said, "Well, what do you mean, Alan?" He says, "We now do eco-gobbons too." So there's your eco-gobbon. It's a few photovoltaic panels, a wee windmill in the roof. So everything's all right. What the house building industry always wants to know is just what most industry, most people want to know is just, can we still do the same piece of shit, but is there a wee thing we can change? Just something we can bolt to it. We'll talk about more of that later. So they want to know about what dumb box you can make and what you can gob on it to make it better. So I would say, well, if that's not the way to do placemaking, what is the way to do placemaking? And I think it's very interesting if we look at the places we really love, and this is Crayon, East Snooker Fife, that sort of house building development is somehow trying to mimic that in a kind of gob-on way, just by throwing the houses about higgledy-piggledy and giving them slightly different roofs and things like that. Actually, if you look at a place like this, there's a really deep order to it. It's done for good utilitarian and not scenic reasons. They've not done it to make it look nice to the tourists. They've made a place for work, for fishing boats. They made somewhere to mend boats and dry nets. They've made a bit of common grazing land. They've put a little marketplace to sell the fish and vegetables and things. And then houses have a little yard to keep a pig in. You can fatten for Christmas. They're very simple utilitarian things. So when I design housing and when I think about placemaking, I think about what the simple utilitarian things we do now. We shouldn't replicate them, though it's interesting that utilitarian things from the past are usable, do make nice places, but the things now we care about are a sunny garden, place for kids to play, somewhere to share a barbecue with your neighbours, a view out to nature, connectivity to shops, schools and services. So the communities I've got to design, and I'll show you a couple, that is what has driven them from the beginning. So this is the one, that's the drawing that I showed them. They said, where are the gob-ons? This is for Stuart Milne. There's a wee suburb on the edge of Bo'ness, doesn't have any shops, etc. But we tried to say, well, if this is the model that you do, what can we do to just make it simpler, to make it work? So we can enjoy the opening out to the gardens. So living spaces are south and a big garden. Now most volume house building has the house kind of adrift in the middle of the site, like you saw on the last slide. So it's a simple thing for us to move it to the back. That then, to move it to the north, that leaves a big sunny garden you can spill out to and surround the house with a kind of tartan grid of trellises and pathways. And then open out to the garden and then make the space so if putting the house at the back would have overshadowed the garden behind, move it to the east so you get the sun into the space behind. Where we had a pit head, make a square, make the houses fan out around the square, connect to nature round about, just link it up like that. So you've got more urban side on one side and more open side on the other. Sunshine and gathering space, connectivity, a place to gather. Locals have barbecues in there, all those sorts of things. And just by doing something that simple, it makes something which to us felt like it had a degree of order and a degree of diversity, but that diversity came from responding to simple utilitarian concerns as they did in the past. So taking that one step forward, and again this is for a volume house builder, Taylor Wimpey. They had to knock down, they wanted to knock down a Grade B listed hospital wing. We did some work to show how you could convert it, and then went on fire. So the planners said you can only demolish it if you use a good architect. So they had to use us. So we then thought we'd do something different for them, and it's interesting to see how they reacted to it. So we've just thought of having sunshine and gathering space at the heart of it. So you see round about are the normal diddy boxes. These are all terraces with their living rooms upstairs facing south and the front doors facing north. It's a slope to the south, so your living room gets a view over the house below, out to the Pentlands. It's on the edge of Edinburgh. So it's sunshine, it's got views, it's got inset terraces, and then we made a little village green at the heart. We always like putting a little village green at the heart. The back doors, the gardens spill out onto and kids play in it, etc. An interesting thing is, commercially, it didn't sell before the show house was open. And then when the show, because they looked too simple for people, the show house opened and people were fighting them, sitting each other for them. And they've resold fantastically well, much better than these houses next door. Also, they're tightly designed, so it's twice as dense as the site next door. In Edinburgh, building land is very expensive. So the house builder made much more, and they could have put the prices up because they sold so well. And yet they won't build them again. It was only because the planners made them do it. They would make more money. They're not even interested in making more money as they would if they built more of these. They just want to do their normal model and get more help to buy, more government assistance to allow them to keep on doing the rubbish they did before. So taking these forward and just complete this year, worked for Edinburgh Council on their 21st century housing programme. This was a nasty 50s block down in Leith with some nice areas around it. That's colonies, which we'll return to. Some history. The walls, this is the old Leith Fort, so the walls were old. There's two adjutants' houses, very old neoclassical buildings behind there. Against this 1950s block. It was quite interesting when it was built, but a lot of asbestos in it, a lot of problems and not good space around it, so it came down. So in terms of replacing it, the usual house builders version would be diddy boxes, 2 not dense, or 4-storey walk-ups, no space in it, no placemaking, or a kind of dockside tall flats for young bankers seeking gin and tonics, not good for families, etc. So I went to look for a model that might be replicated, and there's an old model in Edinburgh called the colonies, which are just wonderful buildings. They were built by workers buying land cheaply and pooling their resources and building them themselves, happy homes for working men. and a very innovative financial model, very dense. There's dense as tenements, but everyone gets a garden, which is a lovely thing to do. You see people sitting out. They're not perfect because the fact that they all go north and south, there's 11 of them in Edinburgh, 11 large sites like that. They all go north and south so that morning sun into one garden, afternoon sun into another garden. So that's a ground floor flat entered from the east. That's a double upper entered up the forestair from the west. So these gardens, the afternoon sun is nicer, sitting out is nicer, and when you come into this flat, you look out your living room window, Mrs. McGlumphy from upstairs is doing the weeding. It's not a very happy social interaction. So we looked to whether we could improve that model. And what I did was took some of the thinking from that last site where all the gardens were facing south and turned all the terraces round so they ran east-west with a bit of west in it, so they could all get the gardens in, and then did a proposal that had the ground floor flat entered from one side and a garden immediately outside it, the double upper entered from the south side, so everyone had, and the garden further out, so everyone was looking into their own garden and all the gardens were facing south. 5 patterns put a village green in the middle next to these old neoclassical buildings, linked it out, there they are, linked it out to the adjacent village green on the post-war housing, and that's village greens from the last one I showed you and what happens elsewhere in the colonies. There it is in the plan. Made all the terraces south and a bit west facing so they're all sunny, and then stitched a parking street through the middle with all the parking off it and round the edge, so it meant that the rest of the links could be closes, pedestrian closes within the development, cars just kept to the middle. And that means on these closes on one side you get these double uppers entered up the forestair, and the ground floor flats entered from the other side with their garden right outside, and then everyone being able to go out to the village green. So there's a standard pattern: ground floor flat, garden, double upper, terrace, which were cost cut, down the stairs into your garden for that flat. So relatively dense layout again, and again cars kept just to the centre of it. So it's now complete. Some of the fights you have are quite extraordinary. So the Housing Association, we did half of these for Edinburgh Council and half of these for a housing association. And the Housing Association said, "So what's with that green space?" And I said, "Well, it's a village green." He said, "Can't have that. Why can't you have that? Kids might play in it." Wow! So at the same time as we are understanding there's a huge problem with children's health, not getting enough exercise, looking at their screens too much, a publicly financed housing institution is saying you cannot have children playing outside. So I fought and fought and fought for this, and they'd eventually let us have it, but they would only allow us have it if it had mounds in it, so you couldn't play football. So we kids could play in it, but you can't kick a football about. So it just seems extraordinary. At the end I had to say, they said to me, "Listen, this is our money and this is what we're doing." I said, "Actually, it's my money, it's our money. This is public money doing this." And they are not applying good practice in terms of children. Working with house builders, you get this all the time. You know, they get told to put children's play equipment in, but they want you to put it in some wee corner out the side because they say how we can't sell houses beside children laughing and playing and things like this. We have a terrible attitude towards our young people. So that's it finished, and it's making a great community. It's looking good. We had a real problem with photographers in that we sent them down strict instructions to take photographs of people and life and mess. And they came back and they just said we couldn't get any decent shots because there was kids' tricycles parked there and there was people playing and there was somebody putting out their washing. So we've still got to take proper photographs, and these are ones that I went down to take because The professional photographs would not take photographs with people in them. It's an absolutely extraordinary thing. So there's a late autumn evening, and kids and buggies and all those sorts of things out and about. It's great. And that's just one. That's won every housing award, from Homes for Scotland, the House Builders Housing Awards, Saltire, etc. And I just love to do them again. I'd love to do them denser. I'd love to do them again with the balconies back in. Maybe if you could put the balconies in for the upstairs flats, you wouldn't need the second garden. You could get them even denser. So, and I also like, they weren't fantastically expensive because they're very repetitive. There's no gob-ons, there's no diddying out and then that architects like to do. It's very simple, repetitious, good. Somebody described housing as the brown bread of the city. It's the kind of background stuff. And it can be wrong to mess about with it too much. So back to the volume house builders. And again, if I'm looking radically about house building, we need to rethink the way we make houses, because that's the way that 99% of new homes are made in Scotland. And it's been engineered down to its utterly most flimsy situation. This is an extraordinarily brittle and flimsy way to make a building. And because it's so flimsy, there are huge problems of it structurally, but also these timbers rot because they're so flimsy. The saw plates are particularly vulnerable. In the 1970s or 80s, there was a big scandal about the rot that was happening in British houses, and the English house building industry went over to block, but Scotland stayed with timber. Obviously, we're so much sunnier and drier up here. But what they did do is that they went to dip their timber kit in rock-proofing, which is toxic. It's a toxic material. It means you can't, if you ever knock down one of these houses, you have to put the timber in landfill. You can't burn it. It also comes with a guarantee which is voided if there's any moisture present, so it's not worth the paper it's written in. Every house in Scotland is dipped in a highly toxic material for no purpose at all other than to allow people to issue certificates. But the salt plates, these buildings were still rotting, so we wrapped our buildings in polythene. And every new home in Scotland is basically, when you go into it, you're going into a polythene bag. When I showed my house with the view earlier, the main difference I think about in my house, going into one of these, is that it smells different. And as architects, we hugely underestimate the power of the other senses. There's a kind of tyranny of the visual in architecture. What looks good in an architecture magazine? We should care about the sound and the smell of architecture too. And my house just smells lovely. You go into these houses, they smell of the chemicals they put in the carpets, the polyurethane and the polyethylene that they've used to wrap them in. And we do understand that there are issues with cars and particulates in the atmosphere, and we say that these are the reasons that our children's health is deteriorating. There's lots of children with respiratory diseases, etc. But it's actually more likely to be the housing environments we bring them up in, because they are full of chemicals. And in a house like this, no water vapour can get out, no CO2 can get out, and no particulates can get out. So if any particulates do get in the house, they can't escape. No chemicals, the chemicals in our carpets, etc., can't get out too because you can't get through. So again, the problem is that we then try and do something else to fix it. And there was a wise man who said, the main stupidity in the world is fixing things before we find out what's wrong. So basically what we've done here is we've engineered a building past any sensible level. To fix it, we then dipped it in rot retardant. To fix the fact that it still rots, we then wrapped it in a poly bag. To fix that, we then have to fit fans, and that's more kit. And capitalism likes that, because it's like selling you stuff to solve the last problem it made. Instead, we should go back to rethinking how we should make buildings. So airtight, no homes. And I worry about passive house too, which we all are supposed to think is the new standard, because passive house is about making the polybag even tighter and putting a fan in. We need buildings that breathe a bit more. So this is how I build when I get the chance. So Laura talked about Arcadia Nursery, using not new materials but natural materials. This is cross-laminated timber, just like plywood that's this thick. It does use glue, so there's better versions than that. Brechtstapel, you should look up. And I'm wanting to use Brechtstapel in my next project, which is just timber stacked on top of each other and dulled. But this is great because it's really good for using low-grade timber. Scottish timber is low-grade because it grows faster here, because it is actually sunnier here than good Siberian timber. So it works well with that. Carbon lock, and it breathes, and you can use it without polythene insulation. So in Arcadia, we used cross-laminated timber, Havatex, wood fibre insulation board, air gap, and then metal cladding on the outside. You don't need anything else in there, and the building looks and smells wonderful for it. You don't need to finish it. It's a timber on the wall. It's a wonderful hard-wearing finish, and it constructed really quick. The builder saved about 6 weeks on site doing it. But the tragedy is it comes from Austria or the Basque Country. We should be doing it in Scotland, and we're not. That's one of the things I'm hoping to persuade the Scottish Investment Bank to invest in, is cross-laminated timber production. So it just happened really quickly. There's the building finished. Kids love it. And the particularly interesting thing for me is that if you look, so there's the hard-wearing finishes. You get good kicking, and they sound great, they smell great. But there's research being done in Germany of a class in a building like that, and a nursery class in a plasterboarded artificial building, and the ones in the timber building had 8,600 fewer heartbeats a day, which meant that they had, they were calmer, they concentrated better, they were less disruptive in class. So it's a sort of virtuous circle of technology that's good for carbon lock, that's good for local industry, that's simpler on site, that's less time on site, and that makes healthier buildings that we don't have to fire polythene at. I don't understand why, the reason why all houses aren't done like this is because the house building industry is set up to deliver you a piece of shit, and it wants funding to keep doing that in a subsidised way without having to rethink the model at all. And there are other architects that have used it. These are a couple of friends who've done homes with cross-laminated timber. Friends as well down in London who've done simple buildings. There's such a wonderful, calm, simple finish. And then these technologies aren't fantastically expensive. This isn't cross-laminated timber, but this is for Edinburgh Council, and this is my project, and we didn't put any polythene in it, and it's all breathable insulation, with instead of metal as the rain screen, with load-bearing brick as the rain screen. So that came in at the allowable cost envelope for social housing. This is proper council housing. Edinburgh is building proper council housing, which is a wonderful thing, and experimenting, letting us do it nice and simply, and experimenting with passive, sustainable, breathable technologies. So I'm hoping to be doing more of that in the future. And I think all these things obviously are reflected or focused through the prism of Grenfell. And you know that there's ongoing investigations into Grenfell. I just worry that they produce a plethora of regulations, allowing people to sell more fire kit to bolt to the building without looking at the essentials of how we build. And I think that there are it's actually everybody knows now, I think everyone knows that the majority of people died in Grenfell died of toxic fume inhalation from the insulation that was under the cladding. So it's a polyethylene cladding that burnt, and underneath it was polyisocyanurate insulation, which doesn't burn quickly, but when it does, gives us cyanin. We make buildings out of and insulate them with materials that contain cyanide. Can you forget? It's just absolutely mental. So I think my rules for housing are very simple. Don't wrap us in polybags, building materials, don't build with materials that are toxic, ignite, contain plastics, not recyclable. So just let buildings breathe and build with natural materials. So I'm trying to put together for housing a pattern language which goes through these financing methods, looks at these place-making things, sunshine and open space connectivity, distance to local shop, and looks at materials in terms of carbon lock sourcing, natural materials, breathability, etc. And the last thing, and maybe it should come first, but in relation to housing, the last thing that seems to me to be critically important is that our taxation system is crazy in that we tax industry, we tax work, but we don't tax wealth. And I've got friend Richard Murphy, not the architect, but the guy who sat in the Tax Justice Network, the most innovative accountant in Britain, is called Richard Murphy, and he's done a brilliant paper. Basically, he's saying offshore, giving people offshore places to squirrel their wealth is clear. Everyone now understands what a bad thing that is, though we're not doing very much about it. But actually, our homes are an onshore offshore. The fact that your parents' house, if your parents own their house, which many of your parents will, their house is appreciated enormously in value. Meanwhile, you can't buy one. And that is because successive governments have allowed us to squirrel away our wealth in our homes, taxed earnings in terms of taxing wealth. It's not a difficult thing to recalibrate, to take money off income tax, off VAT, and put and further tax land value and homes value. So 28 billion a year exemption on main residences from capital gains tax. Wealth resides there untaxed forever. So you can build an awful lot of homes for 28 billion a year. So that's my pitch to become housing minister in a new architect-led government. Actually, one of the things you find out when you get near government, you get near power, is how imbalanced power is, because there are no architects, painters, playwrights, artistic people, creative people, craftspeople in government. They're all lawyers or accountants or trades union officials have gone into government, and we need to be a bit more active and understand. If we want to be good architects, I'm afraid we have to understand a little more of the political context we work in order to influence it. So I hope I've showed you a wee bit of architecture, and if I see you again I'll show you more, but I wanted to tell you what I felt about housing and the things that were important, and I hope that that's of interest. Thank you very much. If you ask a question, I'm happy to answer.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You're talking about density and housing and population growing, and it might be a leading question, but obviously the examples you showed were pretty low rise, so is that a cautious choice not to build high rise, or what's your point of view of that?
I think high rise can work very well. I am interested that some medium-rise parts of Scotland are much denser than places with tower blocks in them. there's a statistic about London that Kensington and Chelsea are actually Grenfell was, but the old parts of Kensington and Chelsea are the densest parts of London. There's nothing there above 6 stories. It's just well integrated. There's parks and things like that too. I think for density you don't necessarily need to go high. You just need to think more carefully about how to look at overlooking, make sure people have garden spaces, etc. So I've occasionally tried to do something high, but I think it's better to look at medium rise is the best way forward for cities, I think. So, yeah.
Cool. I was wondering, as an architect, when you're doing social housing, how do you try convince the developer to want to make better quality social housing? Because in the experience I've had, they just want to make as many houses as possible for as little price as possible, and it's kind of like disheartening.
It is, and it gets particularly disheartening when you can point, as I was trying to show you, point to examples where more money has been made, there's been more houses to sell because you've made it more dense, it's been cheaper because you made it simpler. But it's a bizarre thing. They are interested in money, but they aren't interested in innovating and having to work for it. They just want to do what they do, and they just want to understand what's the next gob on they can use to tick the box for sustainability and say, right, so we tick the box for sustainability, we've ticked the box for tradition, we've ticked the box for placemaking because we made a wee bit hedge here, we've ticked the box for this, we've ticked the box for that. So you tick all these boxes and it's still a piece of shit made out of matchsticks. So to rethink the whole thing, I hope that if there's more social housing, there's more interest from local authorities, housing associations, that might help. But housing associations are very risk adverse too. Don't know if you found that. They have been taught to do what the market does. So they're taught that good practices do what the bad developers do. So they're not very innovative too, and they don't like children. So I'm very hopeful again about this collective self-build initiative. If people themselves get to instruct real architects, we might get to a place where we care more about these things, which obviously we all care about as architects. Yeah.
Do you think within the architectural profession or architectural education as well, that there's a lot of confusion to what sustainability actually is? Because we're told to use, research BREEAM or passive house, but a lot of these, they still promote using polyfree to wrap it to make it completely airtight,
Yeah, I think there is, and I've mentioned passive house. It does worry me about how zipped up it is. We need more research and more innovation on more passive ways. Passive house isn't very passive. You put a fan in it, it's not passive. There's a lot of confusion in general. So a lot of people will think you're being more sustainable if you put more nasty toxic insulation in the building. They were increasing the sustainability of Glasgow School of Art before it burnt by putting PIR insulation in the roof, which was incredible. It was mind-numbing that they should be putting an unbreathable, unnatural material there. So when it burnt, Glasgow would have been full of cyanide at that time. So even good architects forget these things, and I think we need a bit more leadership, or we need to talk about these things more. We need a bit of government research and exemplars put in place. I'm just doing my wee bit on the edge. Yeah.
What do you think is the best way for architects to affect government policy?
Well, another thing Laura asked me whether I talk about is the reform of the RAS, because it's been a matter for me of utter shame how ineffectual the RAS has been in terms of influencing government policy and saying anything that's important, and making people understand the value of our professional skills, which are in building schools whose walls don't fall down, for instance, in thinking about the right materials to use, those sorts of things. So I do think it needs an industry professional institute that is far more effective than the RS has been. It was the RS's AGM yesterday, so I was there. The old president stood down. The old guard weren't there, they hadn't come, they're all beaten. So the RS is going to change and represent those interests better. But it would be good if more architects are interested in their community, if there was better local community councils in Scotland that you could talk to, that you could find things out about, if there's more chance for you to work for local groups. I've been involved in, I've not showed you there, but I'm doing a lot of community asset transfers where communities are taking over old schools, abandoned buildings, parks, and developing them, nurseries, etc. Those sort of bottom-up initiatives are really good to be involved with too. So I would say to try and speak to politicians if you have the chance, to lobby and be part of a new RIS which represents the interests of architects, and where possible to be involved in local initiatives within the places you study or live.
I think the RIS had sort of tried in the past, and obviously Architecture and Design Scotland has been trying to sort of influence, government policy, for many years. But at the end of the day, I don't think politicians, I don't think even this incumbent, government will probably listen to, but won't actually change direction as well. I think it's slightly unfair to sort of blame, to sort of say that the RAS hadn't, sort of tried in the past.
Well, our opinions might differ about that, because I think that they didn't, and they had some good committees, and practice services was good. But at their head, they had someone suffering from a fairly severe narcissistic personality disorder, and that held them back. ADS, I was deputy chair and it was set up, so I know about ADS, and I had to leave because they wouldn't criticise PFI, because that was government's chosen way of building, and ADS said to me, we cannot criticise what the government wants to do. And I said, PFI, so this was 10 years ago, this was 15 years ago, so I said, PFI is going to be a disaster, walls are going to fall down, they're going to turn out fantastically expensive, they're going to produce shit buildings, which you do. Some of the schools that they produce have 40-metre deep floor plates with no light in them, when we know that good spectrum natural daylight is a direct relationship to educational attainment. So the buildings they were building was shit. And ADS wasn't allowed to point out what everyone knew then and now knows, that PFI built rubbish buildings that cost a lot, etc., etc. So I have a slightly jaundiced view about ADS, and I have had about the RAS, but I'm very hopeful for a reinvigorated RAS. Fair or unfair as that may be. 2. Is he the troublemaker?
When you mentioned the land reform at the very beginning, the sort of land acquisition from these landowners, I mean, is that actually going to go ahead, and how difficult is it going to be to watch the landowners?
Well, to tie these two questions together a little, in that it has been a disappointment for me and many people that the avowedly slightly left-wing nationalist government has been so conservative. They have been desperately keen not to rock the boat and change anything. They want to look competent, and they've lost the chance to do big, simple things, to make big changes. However, they have gradually put policies in motion which are resulting in change. So, Community Empowerment Act resulting in land reform that allows asset transfers in communities to get hold of property. That's really important bottom-up thing. National Investment Bank, which the group I've been part of was lobbying and persuading them to set up, that's really important, and will fund things in different ways. So top down as well as bottom up. Land reform, they again with pushing from Commonweal, the group I'm part of, set up this commission to look at land reform. People like Andy Whiteman, the Green NSP, who's a hero in Scottish terms, he's fantastic, pushing on that. That has said to the government that it's recommended the government take on compulsory purchase orders, compulsory sale orders, and is now looking at land value capture. So it's looking seriously at these things, and the government says that it will take on board recommendations that it makes. So these are radical things that may well be happening as we speak. So I'm quite enthused about RIS, about Scottish Government policy, etc.
Do you think that is sort of the responsibility of the RIS in terms of the fact that obviously as architects our job is to, or you know, architects in the process,
You could be architect.
you know, to design good quality architecture, but obviously, you know, you can't know, you know, there's so many other people in part of that process in terms of understanding about economies and, you know, building models and, you know, all these other parts. Do you think that's a responsibility of the RIS to be able to communicate these messages that don't seem to be getting across?
Yes. I think it's all of our responsibility to understand the tools we're given, and if they are meaning that we're making bad buildings or we're not being given enough time and money to make good buildings. I'm working on procurement issues with the RAS to put in front of government, and the problem at the moment is you win a job on the fact that you will put the least amount of effort into the building. That's how you win a job. And I said to the Economy and Business Minister, we need to change this so architects win a job on the basis that the architect has chosen is the one who's going to put the most effort into it. So if you put the most effort in, then you will go and look at cross-laminated timber, Brexit Hall, breathing insulation, those sorts of things. You will make sure that sunshine gets into every courtyard, every door is overlooked, that communities are made, that you listen to the interest and the input of the people you're building for and these things too. So we've got to change. The most important thing for architects to understand is that they are not way down the process. I was told by a banker that architecture was a supply chain component in the building process. So that's like a washer or a doorknob or something like that. And we know that's not the case. We know if we think like that, then walls fall down at schools. We need to understand their importance, and I think it's a good moment to be pushing that, whether through the RS or groups like Commonweal I work with or others.
Just kind of a follow-up question. To what extent do you think it's sort of possible and should be encouraged, maybe, that architects should seek to be developers themselves and look to be developers themselves and look to find funding for problems that maybe they see that other professions don't?
That's a great thing to do. I've often wished I would do it, but I've sometimes felt that architecture is so difficult that I just need to get that right. But then, if you were the developer, maybe you could make life easier for the architect. The difficult thing, if you're a developer, is you do need to think about money, and you mustn't let the architect part of you run away with doing nice things and this and that. You need to be as rigorous as if you were working for a developer, but bring all the benefit of thinking about simplicity and space and different ways of doing things. So it's great when architects do that.
I think, in the past of housing associations, when they first sort of started up, you used to actually get quite a few architects, going and being the sort of development officer in housing associations. But obviously, that doesn't seem to happen, as much nowadays. And it'd be quite good if universities, schools of architecture could actually do a bit more sort of tutoring of the development process.
Yeah.
So actually, so that the students that have done their 5 years of architecture studies could actually move into being part of the housing providers.
I agree. I think that's a good point. And there are some architects in these sorts of places, but they seem to think that they need to become cost control officers immediately sometimes. But the education we get as architects about space and place is valuable and needs to be applied in all different sorts of places, and places where decisions are being made about housing and about finance and about planning, all those sorts of things too. Agreed.
Is that everyone done with?
I suppose following on from that, the conversation about education, do you think it would be useful for universities, schools of architecture to actually have more finance conversations with students throughout the 5
I think
years?
so. Sorry.
No, I'm asking you that question. I'll ask the students the same question. Respond. You can respond.
Yeah. The Part 3 course is really good at the end of the education, because you get, and it must be a bit terrifying for students, but you get suddenly exposed to the big bad world in terms of insurance and legalities and things like that. I always think it should be done a bit earlier in the process, so that part of the student's education at least can be informed by the terrifying knowledge of what happens out there. But I do think, one way or another, students need to be more aware and talk more about the means of production that they work within, the financial constraints, what business wants, and how it clashes with the values that they're developing themselves. Because I think life was very strange as a student, because you do all this wonderful dreaming, and then you go out and you get crushed into a little box of churning out this rubbish, and it's very difficult what you're about to find. And I think it would be
uplifting.
Well, I mean, the uplifting bit is to learn your trade, to learn how to dream, and to learn your trade out there, but not to forget that there are bigger issues there. And as long as you can remember that these bigger issues should relate to making people happy and making the places and spaces in which they're more or less connected, economically effective, and happy, that's what architecture is all about. So don't forget to link the dreaming bit with the cab monkey bit. And wherever you can, try and exploit the potential we have for enriching people's lives. Because when you're old like me, at this moment in time, there are thousands of people in buildings that I've made, and in workplaces, in homes, in dance studios, in nightclubs, and if they get a better view and feel a little better at the end of the day, or bump into someone because I've arranged things a bit better, or don't get a sniff because the building breathes better and things like this, then that's made a huge difference to people's lives, and it's just a wonderful thing.
That's excellent answer. But that question about the finance, as students, would you enjoy going to a finance lecture?
Architecture urban planning unit, we kind of get that from the urban planning side, and it's been really good to hear about the property development processes. Because now I'm kind of, like, especially because I've already got my knowledge from a year out, and I know a little bit about it, by getting to hear about it from the lectures, you're kind of figuring out what's going on the other side. It's not just the architect side, so it's really helpful.
Because I thought it was really useful that you started off talking about finance and then went on to discuss other things within the talk and to contextualise it all for the students. It was also really nice to see a photograph of my old living room.
Yes.
In one of your earlier slides.
I was thinking as I was talking about it. You've moved, haven't you?
Yeah, unfortunately, 10 years of living in your house was great, but
Did you get to kick a football about the green?
well, it was interesting when you were talking about the housing association not allowing kids to kick football.
Yeah.
After a few years of football being kicked around in the green, eventually the housing, the so-called community group within all the other houses kind of complained about the noise coming from the kids.
Yeah.
They got banned
Yeah.
playing football.
Yeah.
Anyway, Edinburgh's 65 miles away from where I work, so
Yeah.
we moved. But yeah, no, it was good to live in one of your houses for a few years. It was an enjoyable place. So I think there might be one other question up there.
So just in regards to the question about like, would we enjoy sort of more things to do with like finance and sort of how this kind of other world works, like outside of architecture school? I think like one thing a lot of architecture students, probably everyone here, has thought about at some point would you want to start your own practice one day? And when is the best time to do that? Is it straight out of university when you have like these, commitments and things like that? But it just seems like such an impossible leap. So some kind of backing of that, I haven't done my year out, but I imagine after that's a bit more clear, but some kind of background knowledge of that sort of world would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, we discussed this in the fourth year, and maybe start your own practice.
Okay.
But not.
You should
be more
You should speak to him scripture when he comes in a few weeks' time, because he's self-taught himself to do his part 3. So
I would also just say on answering your questions that I think in terms of kind of responsibility of the education of architecture students is that in terms of forming ideas about how to solve these problems, we have to understand them in the first place. And it doesn't feel like you get anything apart from your own personal sort of exploration of these things. That's a good way to end, isn't it? So, thank you very much. It's been very enlightening and topical and thank you very much.